Well, thank you, Mark Donfried. As you heard, we are old friends, actually, and I remember very well how he was a student like you, and we had big discussions at the time also on international affairs, and as he said, he worked his senior thesis on jazz and popular culture, and as it was projected into Europe in the interwar period. And of course, this has been an important field for the post-1945 period, the whole question of how did the United States project itself into the world after the Second World War. Now, as you know, he's built up a very impressive enterprise here in Berlin, and I'm delighted to see all of you, and maybe there will be a chance not only to have a good discussion, and please, ask very pointed questions at the end of it, but also if there is anyone who would like to talk to me after this, I think there will probably be a little bit of time, and I may also be here tomorrow afternoon again. So if there are any of you who would like to continue the points that I'm going to raise right now, you're very welcome. Now, I'm a scholar of the American impact on Europe primarily, also during the Cold War, and as you just heard from these publications, I have been interested in on the one hand in how American big business projected itself into Europe after the Second World War, and here I'm not so much interested in the qualitative aspects of it, trade statistics or so. I'm really interested in the qualitative aspects of this projection, and that is what this book is about, and it's also about the relationship that the United States had with Britain on the one hand and with Germany as the two major European countries after the Second World War. And then, however, I've also been interested in what might be called intellectual history, because I have been interested in the big American philanthropic foundations. And in this context overall, as you may well know, there has been this whole debate about Americanization of Europe, or there was even a title of a book that appeared in 1902 by a British journalist who said he was talking about the Americanization of the world. And as you can imagine, this term has been used very critically. I would like to emphasize this. Very few people were taken in by it completely, but one wanted to look at the concept, its usefulness, its applicability. And what, of course, happened is that in all countries that were exposed to American influences, especially after the Second World War, there was resistance also to them. There was anti-Americanism in most cases I know of, and at the same time people discovered some affinities also, and then I think I've always been interested also in the generational responses. There was always an older generation which was much more skeptical about what the United States represented than a younger generation that was much more open and enthusiastic, actually. So what is my agenda for this afternoon? I think I would like to touch upon 4 points. First of all, I would like to look at the origins of philanthropy in the United States. Then secondly, I would like to look specifically at 2 big foundations that spent a lot of money, especially also in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well, namely the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. And in this context, I would like to raise the question of how distant or how close these organizations operated with the state, the American state, with Washington. Because as you can imagine, there were some philanthropies that tried to keep their distance, and others were prepared to cooperate much more closely. And then I would like to look at the post-war period and the activities of these foundations, especially in the so-called American Century, which is this famous title of an essay that Henry Luce wrote in 1941, just before the United States entered the Second World War. And as you will have noticed in the title, what I would like to highlight also is the differentiation between what I would like to call the private sector and its efforts at cultural diplomacy that you are interested in particularly, but then also the public sector, which was also always conducting cultural diplomacy, or state departments around the world, for example. So let me start with and then finally I would like to look at the more recent developments since the 70s, 80s, and where are we now with regard to this American effort to project itself, not just economically, militarily, but also culturally across the world. Okay, as to my first point, as you probably know, in the 18th and 19th century already you did have organizations that were mainly charitable and were based on religious groups, especially in the United States, that, but also here in Europe, that were concerned with the poor in their communities and therefore tried to support them in charitable efforts. But I think we should make a difference between these private efforts in small communities around the United States, also religious groups, sects that supported their members, especially those who had fallen into poverty, and philanthropy. Because in the late 19th century you had a shift in the United States away from charitable work, although that continued to be done, but it was mainly based domestically. It was an effort always that took place in small communities. But then in the late 19th century you have the emergence of philanthropic organizations. The most well-known of the time became the Rockefeller Foundation. And you probably know the background to this. The Rockefellers were some of the robber barons in the United States in the late 19th century when America became an industrial power. And as a result of this, they began to have a guilty conscience also and said, well, we must return some of the money that we have pocketed through our industrial efforts. And there was a lot of exploitation, as you probably know. The Rockefellers and some of the other major names in American industrial history were, of course, very exploitative. So hence the term robber barons. And then I would like to mention another one apart from Rockefeller, and that is Andrew Carnegie. Because while the Rockefeller Foundation was more interested in the promotion of science ultimately and educational efforts, the Carnegie Foundation, Andrew Carnegie, was particularly interested, as you may know, in the international reconciliation and trying to prevent wars or to preserve peace. And that was, of course, the main mission of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which had a lot of money already before 1914. Andrew Carnegie became terribly worried about the Europeans launching themselves or pushing themselves over the abyss into a major war, which happened in 1914. And Carnegie, but also many other businessmen, were terribly worried about this because they knew how destructive this kind of a major war would be. And of course they were all right, whereas the military were more optimistic that it was still possible to win world wars in the 20th century. So here you get the sort of philanthropies emerging in the late 19th century in the US, but of course the American government also became involved in this, and that is where I would like to draw this contrast between public diplomacy and public efforts and private efforts already before 1914. For example, the American government became involved in the pre-1914 period in famine relief. There was a major earthquake in Martinique and in St. Vincent, and when this occurred, it was the American government that put a lot of money in order to reconstruct and rescue these people from these catastrophes. But the important point is that at this time, the two sides still kept rather distant from each other. But then the First World War broke out. And of course, while the United States became involved in the First World War only in 1917, there was already increasingly close cooperation between Washington and these foundations that I've been talking about. And then in 1918, there was a general trend again in the United States because the Republicans came to power and they wanted to make tax concessions and to cut back on public expenditure. And as a result of this, you had the first beginnings of this separation. You said, well, the philanthropies can do good work internationally also. We want to save our taxpayers' money and we don't want to invest too much in public diplomacy ourselves, and they can do it. On the other hand, however, the public effort continued, especially when it came to huge enterprises, huge efforts, and that was the Russian Civil War, and you will have heard of the Hoover famine relief, because in Russia in 1917-18, during the Civil War into 1920-21, you had enormous starvation and millions of people actually died. They also were affected by the Asian flu at the time, which again cost 300,000 lives, I believe. Well, so here you have the Hoover program, and then the American government also became very interested in one country which had, of course, suffered enormously in the First World War, namely Belgium. The Germans had invaded it, and there had been a lot of destruction. In France, it was mainly in northern France where you had the fighting in the trenches, but as the Germans moved through the various communities in Leuven, for example, they burned down the famous library, and there was a lot of damage being done. So the government also began to help together, in this case, with the Rockefeller Foundation to spend money to rebuild the educational system in Belgium. And as a result of this, you had, again, some collaboration, but by and large, you still had this separation. You didn't have a close cooperation yet. But then, I'm moving into the late 1920s, 1930s now, you had increasingly the threat, as it was perceived in the United States, of Bolshevism, because the Bolsheviks in 1917 or 1920, 21 eventually did win the Civil War and were able to establish themselves permanently in the Soviet Union. And then, of course, you also had the rise of fascist movements at first. And in Italy, Mussolini had seized power already in 1922. But in Germany, it was then in 1933 that the Nazis came to power. And these regimes, as you know, were not inhibited by separating between the private sector and the public sector. On the contrary, the public sector had begun to dominate, and therefore they not only tried to change the world politically with through the Comintern, the Communist International, but also culturally, and they projected themselves into other countries, hoping to win them over to the world revolution that Lenin and the Bolsheviks had still proclaimed in 1918, 1718, and that they still hope would succeed eventually. So if you look at the German model, for example, the fascist Nazi model of the 1930s, cultural diplomacy was primarily undertaken by the state. But there was nevertheless still all sorts of private organization, but they were supported or recognized by the state because the state became more and more totalitarian and wanted to control what was going on also in the private sector, so to speak, in Germany. So as a result of this, you have this effort, and this now spills over into the United States. The Rockefeller Foundation in the 1920s and early 30s had still supported philanthropic enterprise, especially in the field of science. That's what they had been interested in. But also, it was a science, a statistical science in the 1920s already, demography. And the Rockefeller Foundation became involved in enterprises that were concerned with population control. And that, to them, involved science also, because they feared an overpopulation in India, for example, and therefore tried to persuade the Indian government or the colonial governments that they should have population control programs, which they supported. These were often very dodgy programs, one should say this openly, because they involved sterilization. And often the women who were persuaded by doctors paid by the Rockefeller Foundation sent out there were not really told what it involved. And the same is true, of course, of many men who were also persuaded to get themselves sterilized. So the Rockefeller Foundation, having supported science, felt after the war rather compromised as a result of this when it came out that many of these experiments, also in Germany, which the Rockefeller Foundation continued to support in the field of science, had been, of course, terribly misused and compromised. And as a result of this, the Rockefeller Foundation became much more careful after the Second World War in terms of its programs, especially with regard to population control and demography, because that had been so compromised. Carnegie is also an interesting case, because as I said, they were much more interested in the projection of peace efforts, and they collaborated closely with the League of Nations, and some of you may have studied the League of Nations experience in the 1920s and 30s, which was not a very cheering one, as you know, because there were many efforts to conciliate and mediate between warring parties, but then with the rise of fascism and Japanese power in the 1930s, the League of Nations became the paper tiger, basically. And I think there are now many books, quite interesting researches being done to look at why this first experiment at international organization failed, and out of which, of course, the United Nations emerged, and what lessons can be learned from the League experience for the position of the United Nations in the world, which again, as you know, is also often in a very difficult position when it comes to great power politics and the Security Council and the way world politics is being conducted often by the relatively few powers on the Security Council. Now, the reason why in the 1930s Washington was still rather reluctant to get involved in these efforts was that, of course, in the American public you had isolations. That had gone back to the early 1920s. The American public just didn't want to get involved in great power politics. And there was this sense that you should let the Europeans stew in their own juice. They had unleashed this First World War, and as a result of this, let them solve their own problems, which of course turned out to be disastrous because the Europeans didn't solve their own problems, and as a result of this you have the radicalization of the populations, especially in Nazi Germany, but also in Italy and elsewhere, and all of a sudden the Americans or the Western powers were confronted with the threat of another world war. And here again, of course, Carnegie tried to intervene and prevent this, but it wasn't very successful. Now, as a result of this, this experience of collaboration among the dictatorial powers of Europe, and also the experience that you had to make a major effort in order to win the war, the public sector and the private sector, that is the philanthropies, began to cooperate more closely together again in the Second World War, and there were various committees which were concerned with the planning for the post-war world, because once the United States had entered the Second World War, it was probably only a matter of time until the Nazis, the Italians and the Japanese would lose this war, simply because the industrial power of the United States was so much superior to what the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese could bring to bear. And in addition to this, of course, there was then also the problem that the occupation policies of these powers so turned the populations against the occupations that, of course, the Second World War was more or less certain to be won, but it took, of course, much longer, and the losses as a result of this last-ditch effort, especially of the Japanese and Germans, until the summer of 1945 or spring of 1945 was much more disastrous. Well, as a result of this, after the Second World War, this cooperation continued. You didn't separate and keep your distance completely again as you had done after the First World War. And it's now very interesting how the Republicans come to power, Eisenhower in 1952-53, and again the same problem. The Republicans, you can see this to this day, want to cut taxes and want to reduce public expenditure. So that was the strategy, but fortunately there were the philanthropic organizations which were now interested in projecting American cultural power, soft power, into Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And the reason for this was that the Europeans after the Second World War probably just about acknowledged that the United States was #1 in the Western Alliance in terms of military power and also in economic power. But when it came to cultural power, there were many Europeans who were, I would like to call it, rather arrogant, and said, well, you know, you Americans may be a powerful economic nation and military nation, but culturally you are really a bit inferior to us because we have created high culture, and look at our music and look at our paintings and look at our cultural achievements. And I hope you can see that this was terribly irritating to many Americans, both intellectuals, but also to the people at these foundations, who said, damn you, we are going to show you that we are also a cultural power. And that is where you now get the efforts, the projection of American money, philanthropic money into Western Europe, first of all, to combat this anti-Americanism and to link up with the sort of more positively inclined intellectuals and politicians in Western Europe. And as a result of this, you now have, first of all, exchange programs. You have also the sending, the support of libraries, etc., in Western Europe. And I think also very interestingly, the support of intellectual journals. The Ford Foundation supported several intellectual journals, and this is the pre-television age and the pre-Facebook and Twitter age, as you can imagine. So reading of intellectual magazines was still very important. In England, the most important one, you may have come across it, was Encounter, which was the English language intellectual journal, where ideas about obviously the Western Alliance and intellectual ideas were being debated. The French had Prof, a very similar magazine. The Italians had Tempo Presente, and in the Spanish-speaking world, in Latin America, you had Quadernos. So, and in Germany, you had Der Monat, which also is a journal which existed for a long time. And I mention this because I don't know what your plans are in the field of cultural diplomacy, but it's very interesting, if you are historically inclined, to look at what kinds of themes were covered in these journals and who wrote for them. And you will find really some very prominent names, actually, who belonged to an organization that was funded by the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was actually founded in 1950 here in Berlin as a counter to, again, the Soviet effort to project its image abroad and into Western Europe. So the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a very interesting organization, but here you get now the merger increasingly between the private sector and the public sector, because the Congress for Cultural Freedom was also funded by the CIA. And when this became public in 1966, it was covert funding, of course. There was a big scandal, and the Congress for Cultural Freedom collapsed, and it had a sort of successor organization that never worked very well, because the foundations, Ford in particular, have also gotten cold feet and said, well, we shouldn't really support these enterprises anymore. But what is interesting also is that, of course, the Americans, cultural diplomacy, were also becoming interested in projecting their culture into Eastern Europe. And especially after the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 and the Polish unrest in that same year, when there was a thaw period and Khrushchev had made his speech in early 1956, and you had this upheaval, it seemed that Stalinism was disappearing and that there was a ferment among intellectuals in Eastern Europe, which the Ford Foundation, but also the Rockefeller Foundation now tried to buy into, and said, well, if we arrange exchanges with Polish sociologists to come to Britain or to West Germany or to the United States, maybe they will not just write in purely Marxist orthodox terms as they had been required to under Stalinism, but they will also be interested in how Western societies analyze themselves, especially their industrial systems and their political systems. So I hope you can see that there was also this reaching across the Iron Curtain, and it's really quite fascinating. It was not just in the social sciences, but also in the sciences that you had this effort, this projection, because it was especially atomic physicists who, when, of course, the hydrogen bomb was finally invented in 1953, and you have this enormous destructive power, that many American but also European physicists became rather worried and got cold feet about a third world war, which might lead actually to a destruction of this planet. And it's now very interesting because there's one famous physicist who got a Nobel Prize. His name was Niels Bohr, who had his labs in Copenhagen, and he now became a sort of hub for contacts between the Americans and also Western physicists who were invited there, and also Eastern physicists. And since it was a small country which, was not having a major cultural diplomacy effort in the world, the Soviets also said, well, okay, our scientists can go there. And I would argue that the origins of détente of the 1960s and the attempt to re-establish a dialogue after the height of the Cold War in 1954-55, or even earlier under Stalin, is partly due to these efforts that were private efforts, again, if you like. And I would even go so far as to argue that the red telephone, which I'm sure you've all heard about, this link that was established between the White House and the Kremlin, where you could phone quickly and say, terribly sorry, we've just launched a missile by mistake and it's coming across the Atlantic. Terribly sorry, we do something about it. It's this kind of connection, I hope, and I'm trying to exaggerate, of course, here, that became more and more important and prepared the way for detente then in the 1960s under Kennedy and in subsequent years. So I hope you can see that there was this major effort. And of course, what now also happened was the slow introduction of American popular culture. It was not just high culture that the Europeans became interested in at the time, but also, on the one hand, American jazz, and the younger generation was very enthusiastic about this, and then also rock and roll, and here in Berlin, but also in Hamburg and the major cities, you had suddenly Elvis Presley and Bill Haley in rock and roll concerts, and the young people were very enthusiastic about this. But of course, the Ford Foundation was not interested in popular culture or Hollywood, because Hollywood film also came to Europe at the time. James Dean and Marlon Brando were the heroes, of course, of a younger generation in those years. But it was also high culture, if you like. But it's again very interesting now what happened in this dialogue across the Atlantic. Take Jackson Pollock. The New Yorkers considered themselves, after the Second World War, the avant-garde of the visual arts. The center has moved now from Paris and Munich or other Western European cities to New York. And then, I don't know whether you've seen Jackson Pollock's huge canvases, which are very chaotic, actually. When this was displayed in Europe, shown at exhibitions, the Europeans said, "Oh, this is not art. Our paintings are much more interesting." And as a result of this, you have this ambivalence again when it came to high culture, which of course angered the people at the Ford Foundation, but also many American intellectuals. And nowadays, Jackson Pollock's paintings fetch millions of dollars, as you know, but in those years he was rejected. So it's this steady erosion of this American effort that you have. Now, there was then a further shift, because so far I've mainly talked about Europe in the Cold War period and the American cultural diplomatic effort. America Houses here in Berlin was, of course, a public diplomatic effort. This was not the big foundations, where you had actual presentations funded by the State Department and the international cultural diplomacy conducted by Washington in those years. But on the other hand, you always had also the private effort that I started off with at the beginning. But in the late 1950s, the Americans felt, well, we've really been quite successful in Europe. They have turned a corner economically because there is now much greater prosperity. Germany, but also other European countries have been rebuilt. And also politically, they have a fairly stable political system, parliamentary democratic systems. And it is at that moment that you had Kennedy, of course, in the 1960s now, fixing his eyes on the Third World. And you probably know that the Cold War also moved away from Europe, where you had detente and increasing dialogue between the two sides, especially also the Germans under Willy Brandt here in Berlin, and the attempt to build bridges with Poland and the Soviet Union, and ultimately culminating in these treaties that were then signed in the 1970s. But the main effort and the Cold War also moved to the major powers in the Asian world and in Latin America. And that is, of course, where you had the struggle between East and West continuing, which was also based on a cultural projection and not just on a military and economic projection. At least this would be my point. So there is the larger problem of the role now of foundations and especially philanthropic and American foundations in the world. And that is where I want to end, because you will have followed the recent debate that Bill Gates, who has now the biggest philanthropic organization in the world, he is projecting it domestically into education, but also internationally into education. And he's spent already many millions, and people have become quite critical of whether one individual, or he and his wife, should really determine with the billions that they have at their disposal which educational turn different countries should make. So there have been debates about what the role of these big foundations should be, and what if the outcome of their efforts in Africa or wherever are totally wrong and lead to disaster, as some of the efforts in the 1950s already, 60s already did. And then there is another philanthropy in America right now, the Koch brothers, but also George Soros, the Open Society, which was also an attempt, of course, to project private enterprise, private money into especially Eastern Europe, and I believe quite a few of you are coming from that part of the world. And as you probably know, again, there has been a debate which I wanted to put to you, perhaps in terms also of questions that you may wish to raise. So my conclusion, therefore, what is the best relation between private and public diplomacy? Should you have both, and in what way should you have the influence of the private organizations? And here I want to end up with this interesting scheme that a former employee of the Ford Foundation, Walter Nielsen, put forward in a book on the big philanthropies, where he said there are different ways in which the private sector and the public sector can interact. I've talked about them already. You have either complete separation. The one does something totally different from the public sector. You have a second possibility, some cooperation, but you are very conscious of keeping your autonomy in terms of the programs that you project into other parts of the world. Then the third model would be a closer cooperation where you coordinate your efforts. And that is actually what happened in Washington between the big foundations and Washington in the 1950s. Then you have another model where you could think of a foundation agreeing to be a front organization for American public cultural diplomacy, but it would be covert. The money would be channeled into this organization, which is what the CIA did actually with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the final solution which I wanted to put to you, because I found it particularly interesting, is the pilot fish idea. That you know that whales have pilot fish swimming around them as they go through the oceans. And the idea was that big governments, when they have cultural diplomacy or any kind of public effort, are like the whale, rather cumbersome, bureaucratic. They often don't know which direction they want to go to. And this is where Nielsen argued the philanthropies can come in, perhaps, because they can now nudge the big governments perhaps into sustainable development or poverty relief, but of a particular kind in Africa, or HIV support relief, and so on. So I think that's quite an interesting image and metaphor, if you like, and that's where I would like to end, because I would be interested in how you see studying cultural diplomacy, the kind of effort that's being made still to this day by the private sector on the one hand, but also, of course, by governments and the public sector. Thank you very much.